Welcome to the All Things Endurance podcast. I'm your host, Rick Prince. I'm excited to have on the podcast today Dr. Marco Altini. Marco Altini is an expert in heart rate variability. As many of you know, the HRV is what it often is denoted as. He's a data scientist as well as an endurance coach. He's also the founder of HRV4training.com, which is an HRV app. He holds 2 master's degrees in computer science engineering as well as movement sciences. And he also holds a PhD in data science. So, Marco, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Rick. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, looking forward to this one. I think, you know, HRV is something that by now most people, or at least in the endurance sports world, are pretty aware of. But I think there's also maybe not as much information as there probably should be. And like all areas of endurance sports, I'm sure there's a lot of maybe myths out there or things that, maybe that they're not untrue, but things that maybe there's a little bit of confusion about. We'll put it that way. So before we get into the meat of the podcast today, maybe you could tell our listeners just a little bit about yourself, how you got into sort of specializing in HRV.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't, a plan I had, let's say. It sort of happened. As you said, I have different masters, and the beginning actually was in computer science and in technology, let's say. So not really in physiology or anything HRV related. I didn't really find anything that was particularly interesting to me in the computer science world until I had the opportunity to do a course in which we started playing with sensors placed on the body to
Hmm.
measure, brain activity and muscular activity and heart activity. This was 15, 16 years ago. So before we had, the wearable sensors that we have today, basically early prototypes of these systems. And then I thought, wow, this is interesting. Now I can use my skills for something that, picks up my interest a bit more. I
Yeah.
start to look at what happens in the body as we face different stresses, different challenges, and you go about life and training, and sports has always been an interest of mine. So slowly I was exposed to these type of technologies and signals, and HRV was one of them. It was one that was particularly interesting for me, maybe because I wasn't particularly good at managing stress. I always was a bit of an anxious person, so there's always a bit of a personal component in why we go one way or the other. And then it sort of happened that way. And then many years later, actually, I studied sports science and human movement sciences, because then at that point I wanted to complement my knowledge as I was building these tools and trying to help people making sense of the data.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, I like how you mentioned that, a lot of times the path we choose professionally is sort of on a personal level as well, sort of an exploration of that. So maybe we could just start off by, especially for any of our listeners that either don't know what HRV is, heart rate variability, or, more of the specifics. So I guess let's start there. What exactly is HRV and why is it an important metric to assess and track?
Yeah, so technically speaking, when we talk about heart rate variability, it is what the name says. So the variability in heart rate over a period of time. So if we look at our heart beating over, let's say, a minute, it's not beating, for example, exactly every second, even if we have 60 beats per minute. There is always some variability between consecutive beats. And that's what we quantify with what we call HRV, or heart rate variability.
Okay.
And we do that because this variability is not random, but it is due to how the nervous system is modulating heart activity. And the nervous system is doing that in response to stressors. So basically, we cannot measure stress, this somewhat abstract entity. We cannot measure non-invasively the nervous system, but we can measure something that is heart rate variability, which is impacted by how stress modulates nervous system, and then the nervous system again modulates heart rate variability. So it's an indirect measurement, basically a proxy of our stress response, and that's why we do it and why it could be insightful. It's just a way that non-invasively we have to look at how the body responds to stressors.
Okay, gotcha. So you mentioned sort of in your intro that when you got started in this, it was before sort of all the wearables and all that kind of stuff, like Aura and Whoop and all that kind of stuff. So, moving on to the next question, and you said that HRV is a proxy for this. It's not this invasive exact thing, but do wearables accurately track HRV? And maybe the next question then is there a gold standard for assessing HRV?
Yeah, so I would say it depends on what we are looking at and what we are interested in. In general, in the concept of sports, but even outside of it, what we want to look at is our resting HRV, because HRV is impacted by all sorts of things. And then we want to have a protocol that isolates all of these factors because they confound the measurements. For example, if I was measuring now as I talk, that would create artifacts and the data would not be particularly representative of my stress level. Similarly, if I just drink water, that will also create changes in how HRV responds
Mm,
because of maybe changes in even just blood plasma volume, and the everything changes in the body dynamically in response to everything that we do. Some of these things are stress related, some of these things are just artifacts. For example, if I'm yawning or swallowing saliva, something we do like thousands of times in a day, that also creates changes in heart rhythm that,
mm,
however, have nothing to do with stress. But still, this would be captured by an HRV measurement. This is to say that pretty much anything impacts this measurement. So for this measurement to be meaningful in the context of our stress response, it is important that we take it in a certain condition. And typically this means two conditions are possible. One is first thing in the morning, and the other one is throughout the night. First thing in the
okay.
morning, because we isolate this context a bit like we do, for example, sometimes if we measure our blood pressure, if we measure our glucose, or if we measure our body weight, like all sort of things that we do before we intake food, before we exercise, before we get stressed about something. So it's just a simple routine that we can reproduce every day. Through the night, similarly, we are asleep typically, so it's also a context that we can reproduce every day, in this case, every night, in a similar way. And so it's a valid assessment of our resting physiology. I will add that there are differences between these two situations that I think for the people that use these tools are still important to know, because obviously it's not the same. Like the night comes first, and then there is the morning measurement. So even just because of that, there can be inconsistencies in the data when we look at these two protocols. So the night, in my experience, tends to better capture our behavior the previous day or the evening, just because it's closer. So it might take more time for the body to renormalize after a stressor. If we train in the evening, if we eat a bit late, if we drink some alcohol, all of these things tend to be captured in the night data
Mm,
because it's just closer to the data, to the measurement. And in the morning, it's a bit later. So at that point, the body might have renormalized. So I think the morning becomes a better time to make basically a change maybe in our training, or to assess if there is something that is still impacting our body negatively, a stressor that is still, causing a suppression in HRV still in the morning. Then it is something that it was not just a transitory stressor or an evening stressor, but it's something that we need to be a bit more cautious about or not. So for training prescription, maybe the morning is more ideal, while to assess behavior, and if we want to that maybe learn something also from that and make changes in our behavior, then the night can also capture that data a bit better. So it depends a bit also on the application that we have in mind. But in general, both methods are valid. And of course, some are maybe easier. Like in the night, you wear a sensor, one of the devices that you mentioned, so that you don't have to do anything. In the morning, we can get maybe, again, a bit more useful data in the context of training, but we do have to take a measurement. So that is something that might fit in someone's routine, but not in everyone's.
gotcha. Is there any value to capturing HRV data throughout the day, whether it just be normally or even if you're working out and exercising, things of that nature?
Yeah, so there is a difficult topic in a way. So it's an application that is being pushed recently also by wearables
Okay.
because they try to do this. In my opinion, most of the times we are looking at artifacts, so we are looking at data that is not really representative of our stress response. Sometimes we also risk to get people to look at stress very negatively because we look at things very acutely.
Hmm.
And stress response is normal. We need stress. We need to respond to that stress. And it's all good. It's part of how we grow also as athletes or in general. And then I think we risk to make basically any stress response something pathological almost, right? Because you're stressed, that is bad. The connotation that is given to this kind um, of processes. But I don't think that's how it works. I don't think the technology can capture our stress response in those cases. I think we have a decoupling there between, okay, you can always measure something, but the meaning of what you're
Right.
measuring is not anymore our stress response because we are looking at it in a situation in which we have all sorts of artifacts, again, just swallowing saliva, talking, drinking water, eating, like anything impacts us. We don't know how to interpret many of the signals, even if we weren't doing anything in particular. Digestion changes things also in ways that, again, don't represent actually how the nervous system works because HRV, a higher HRV typically is associated with an increased parasympathetic activity, which is the part of the nervous system in charge of rest and relaxation. But then if we are digesting after eating food, the nervous system is also more parasympathetic because the digestive part of the process of digestion is driven by the parasympathetic nervous system. But then the tool will tell you otherwise because digestion also increases your energy expenditure and your heart rate, and then your HRV tends to be suppressed. So again, we have a decoupling between the measurement and we are actually trying to capture indirectly. And so I think that the best use we have, long story short, is to really look at the data in at rest, first thing in the morning or in the night. Otherwise, we are, measuring something, but I do not think that it represents what we think it does.
Right, right. So basically the to kind of almost even sum all that up, sort of by doing it in the morning or excuse me, while you're sleeping is almost to eliminate as much of the outside noise, the outside variables as possible then that could kind of misrepresent the data, for lack of a better word.
Exactly, exactly. Because what we really care about is how the body responds after a while after the stress, right? Because we want to give the body the stressor and the opportunity to recover. And then we want to assess, okay, have we recovered? And to do that, we can measure every 24 hours, so once per day, night or morning, because that is enough time for the body to basically come back to homeostasis. And we don't need to look at it every 2 seconds, because basically, if we have not recovered, then we will carry the stress for 24, 48, more hours. But if we have recovered, then we have normalized and we can, keep applying stress or, keep doing whatever we have planned to do. And that is, I think, the best use case eventually for this technology.
Gotcha. So when these products out there, like whether it be Whoop or Aura or any of those that maybe in an Apple Watch it tracks HRV, what do they use as the benchmark? Sort of as that gold standard? Is it like EKG or how do they determine the accuracy, based off of some type of gold standard?
Yeah, that's right. So the reference would be an ECG, so the
Okay.
electrical activity of the heart that, we can all measure these days with something like, a polar chest strap or something like that. And then you look at how the optical system at the wrist, at the ring, or, with the phone cameras in the app or things like that compares with the electrical activity of the heart to determine if the device is accurate.
Okay. Gotcha. So next question, is HRV affected by age or gender? As far as, yeah, some other just variables that all of us might need to potentially consider.
Yeah, so at the population level, I would say that age is maybe the most important factor,
Okay.
even though something I think it's important to stress when talking about this metric is that individual variability is extremely high and much higher than the variability between groups. That
Okay.
means that Two people of the same age could have HRVs that are extremely different. And at the same time, a younger person might have an HRV that is much lower than an older person, which is the opposite of what you would expect because HRV decreases with age, right? So you can never give an HRV guess the age or even the age group, not even within 10 years of a person. Like the individual variability is really high. That
Yeah.
is why eventually it's very difficult to make population level inferences from this data. And in terms of gender, there's differences typically between men and women up to menopause, I would say.
Okay.
Then some of these differences sort of fade. So obviously the reasoning there is that these differences are driven by hormonal differences that then basically also fade. Um, but the literature would say there is a bit inconsistent. So typically the values are still pretty similar, or maybe women might have slightly higher HIV values despite a slightly higher resting heart rate. Um, but again, very small differences. And at the end of the day, the data is really useful the most when looking at relative changes for an individual as opposed to comparing to others, even people similar to us.
Right. Gotcha. That makes sense. So knowing that it is highly individualistic, in your research, have you found that there is sort of a median HRV for, say, certain ages? I mean, obviously there's trends. I didn't know if there were any specific sort of median HRVs, knowing, right, that high is generally better, low is generally not as good. Is there any data out there regarding that, or is it just focus on the individual?
Yeah, so there is data, but then when we look even at maybe we could call them more extreme cases, or where we look at health individuals and then people that have maybe some health conditions, some chronic condition, like any sort of issues with their health, and then we look at the differences in HRV. And even when you read that, hey, HRV is different in these different conditions, it's a good marker maybe of this or that condition. But then if you go and look actually at the distribution of the values, so even just the range of the values for the two categories, because maybe, again, the median or the average is a bit different. One group has, typically the one with a chronic condition has slightly lower HRV, but if you look at the range, again, there is almost complete overlap. Maybe
Okay.
80-90% of the
Hmm.
range is the same. So again, so hard to basically do anything with that. That's why I think people tend maybe to read a lot about higher HRV and lower HRV is not good for your health and things like that. And but they worry a lot. But I think
Yeah.
there's really no need to worry because there is basically complete overlap between categories of people. And in our tests we had, if we look at RMSSD, which is this marker that is typically used to compute HRV, um, the values that go from what is considered a low value, let's say 15, 20 milliseconds, up to 200, 250, which is, I would say, outliers, rare to find. You can cover that entire range for healthy people. So
Mm.
eventually, I don't think we can make the conclusions that people sometimes make.
Yeah. And the reason I asked that, I think so, there's so much data, so much information out there because of social media, and it's easy to access now. And not many people go to, peer-reviewed journals and those kinds of things. So I think oftentimes people will just like Google, or maybe now put in AI, like what's a good HRV? And then it's just black or white, like, hey, I'm healthy or I'm not healthy, or I'm stressed or I'm not stressed, I'm good or I'm bad. So I really appreciate that
Yeah, for
that
sure. I
information.
will just add one thing. There's, for example, cases in which you have the opposite. So if you look at conditions like anorexia, we know that people with anorexia have higher HRV
Mm,
than people that do not have it. So,
interesting.
we always need to add context, and we cannot simplify it with, higher is better.
Right. No, I really appreciate that. So next question, this is sort of on the application front, from an endurance athlete perspective. Should an athlete change their training based on HRV? And moreover, let's say someone, again, while you said that low isn't always bad, high isn't always good, but if someone has a low HRV relative to themselves, at least, sort of on that individual basis, let's say over 3 or 4 days, is that sort of cause for alarm? So I guess maybe the question is, if I'm tracking this while I'm sleeping and maybe let's say tomorrow I'm supposed to do an interval workout but based on myself, I find that I have a pretty low HRV score. Is that something where I should be modifying my training? Okay, maybe instead of doing interval, I should just take the day off or go for an easy run, or what does that look like when it pertains to HRV versus or how that applies to training?
Yeah, yeah. So that works pretty much as you said, meaning that we had at this point almost 2 decades of research looking at this, which is typically called HRV guided training, right? So you guide HRV, you guide training based on HRV. And then the way this works, it has evolved a bit. Like in the earlier days, you had a suppression in HRV, and then you would implement a change. The change would
Okay.
typically be reduce training intensity. Now, we moved away from that a bit to be less reactive.
Okay.
So, as you suggested, we have a couple of bad days. HRV is low for a couple of bad days, for a couple of days instead of just a single day.
Okay.
That typically means that our baseline, which is a week average, is also reducing below what we call our normal range, which is just what is considered our normal physiology, again, because there is no population level ranges that are good or bad. So we use maybe a month or two of data to determine what is normal for us. And then when our weekly average is below this, then we implement a change, which means,
Okay.
again, typically we just lower training intensity. So we had an interval session, the baseline is below the normal range, and we're like, okay, let's just do an easier session. And the studies that have investigated this typically have found that at the end of the study, even if this group using the HRV guided training has done maybe a little less hard training because sometimes they had to skip it, they still perform better. Because I
Mm,
think at the end of the day, we all understand that when you apply the stressor, also matters. It's not just about the stressor. You need to assimilate the stressor, respond to it, right, and improve after applying the stressor. And if your body is not ready to assimilate that stressor, which is something that can be indicated by your physiology not being able to bounce back to normal for a couple of days, then it's basically better not to do that session than to do it, to still do it. And that's a bit
yeah.
what the research has shown. And I always like to add that that is still, it's not a study. You have to have, a simple thing that you test, and life
Yeah.
is more complex than that, right? We need to add context. We need to see how we feel. We might want to make a change for all sort of other reasons. Sometimes you have a suppression and you don't want to wait a week of suppressions because maybe you're sick and you know that you're sick. So it's really a good day to make a change early. So,
Right.
there's context needs to be added to these studies, but I think the assumptions and, the studies that have looked into this have shown that there's consistent improvements. So it's a way that we can use this technology in the context of training for sure.
Yeah, that's amazing. And while you said, context certainly does need to be added, I think that's really valuable information. Excuse me, because I think so much, especially endurance athletes tend to be type A, a lot of them.
Yeah.
And, more is better. Rest days are the worst thing ever. Tapering's terrible. I just got to keep pushing more mileage, more volume, more whatever. So it's nice to hear, context aside that the research does show that kind of listening to your body, for lack of a better word, via data with the HRV, certainly makes sense. You mentioned some of the things earlier that affect HRV, everything even just from swallowing to digestion. What are, from an athlete standpoint, what are some of the most common things, maybe the biggest things that affect HRV?
Yeah, I would say it's something that we need to keep in mind, especially for people that maybe are not professional athletes, which is, the most people, most of
Yeah,
us, is that there's more in our life than training, and
yeah,
typically demanding jobs and, stress from work or family or everything that is our life can have a great impact on our physiology. And that is something that we can often see. So more stressful periods at work, um, other concerns, again, in the family or things we care about, they tend to show up in the data, sometimes more than training. So
sure.
that is, in a way, it's a challenge because those
Yeah.
things are not easy to change, right? The reason why we use HRV a lot in training more than in other applications is that training can be easily modulated. So if I have a hard session, okay, I don't do a hard session. That is easy to do. But if I have a really tough week at work, that's just how it is. If I'm going through,
Right.
a divorce, it's also how it is. It's not something that I cannot say, okay, this week I don't do this. So
Yeah.
it's a bit more challenging, but it can open our eyes sometimes, and we can maybe implement some changes. So we need to remember that we have always two ways to address these changes in our stress response, right? So again, it's not stress, it's the stress response. So if we have a lot of stress, but we respond positively, still HRV will be normal. If we do not respond positively to the stressor, we will have a suppression, and that's when we should try to do something about it. One way, again, is to modulate the stressor, but the other ways is also to try to work more on the recovery side of things. So basically, it could be that we pay more attention to sleep, we pay more attention to our diet. We do all sorts of things that can basically improve the rest and digest part of the nervous system. That is not about removing stressors, because maybe we don't have control over those. So we have always these two factors to play with. So again, life stress, then it could be sleep. If we travel a lot, traveling, obviously, it's a big thing. Needless to say, sickness, it could be small things, or bigger things, but those have strong impact on our physiology. So I would say these factors tend to be pretty strong, especially for people that are well trained. It's the life around training that shows up in
Yeah.
the data more. And sometimes that is, I think, the value of the tool, even though people might start because they want to see the effect of training. But training is something that we might be more used to also as a stressor. Sometimes it could be even a stress relief sort of situation. So
Yeah.
it's not necessarily an insight that we will get about training as much as it is about everything else.
Yeah. That's such a great point because I think so many endurance athletes, I think, or just people in general, I think they're aware, right? Okay, of life stressors, work, relationships, all that kind of stuff. But when it comes to tracking, these values, whether it be heart rate or HRV or whatever it is, they only tend to look at it oftentimes through the lens of, okay, what kind of workout did I do today? And so I think that's so valuable to note that, it's these things don't exist in isolation, right? They're all correlated. And I think it's that I love the fact that you mentioned that sometimes these life stressors show up more, or have more influence over the HRV than that training session. And to your point, how you respond to stress versus the actual stress. I guess, like you said, people can't just quit their job and go live in, some amazing land where everything's perfect all the time, right? Um,
Exactly.
so with HRV, I think one of the, I guess for lack of a better word, problems is, and I find this with all these wearables and all this stuff, there's just so much data. There's so many data points, and it's almost overwhelming. I feel like I always use the example, it's kind of like Excel, right? Like, I think I use probably 1% of it. Once you go over that, my head kind of explodes, but yet I didn't use it anywhere near the capacity that it probably can be used for. So, that being said, what are some other data points that might be able to be correlated with HRV to give maybe a better overall picture of health, of recovery? Are there any other valuable data points that athletes should be looking for and potentially correlating with HRV?
Yeah, so I think that if we stick to what we can measure, so we already remove a lot of what is somewhat guessed by the sensors that we have, right? There's a lot of things that are estimated, our recovery readiness. Every company calls it a bit differently. I
Yeah.
think things here there are models that makes a lot of assumptions. Less sleep means that you need recovery. On my end, I try to isolate, behavior, what we do, and our physiology, how it responds. So that's why I prefer to look at, the two things separately, and the measurements, like the measurements of resting physiology. And when we look at HRV, I think we always need to look at it in the context also of our resting heart rate. On many
Okay.
occasions, they change in opposite directions, but that is not always the case. So one of the reasons to go through the trouble of looking at HRV is that it's a bit more sensitive to stress with respect to resting heart rate.
Okay.
So there are situations in which maybe we have a suppression in HRV, but our resting heart rate remains normal. I think that in a way is also a relief, meaning that if something was wrong with our health, we were getting sick or something like that, it is likely that our resting heart rate would also be elevated together with the suppressed HRV. While if only the HRV is suppressed, then still maybe we can think about, hey, what did I do or what could be causing this poor stress response? And maybe we can make some small adjustments, or we can just give it a day or two, see if it normalizes again. So I think sometimes we can distinguish between, situations that require maybe a change with situation that we might just want to see how they play out another day or two, just by looking at both resting heart rate and HRV. Another signal that is interesting to look at that is not provided by any applications, but you can sort of look at it as you look at the data in a way, meaning that is what we call the coefficient of variation, which just means how much does your data change on a day-to-day basis. So
Mm.
if we have a certain average in a week, it could be that every day is the same, or it could be that it jumps up and down, but it's the same average, right? This is the coefficient of variation. So there have been multiple studies showing that when our data is still within what we consider normal, but there is more variation, so it jumps a lot more. That is also a sign typically of a poor response. Typically
Mm.
stability is better. So that is also an indication that maybe there is something that we are not really responding well to. We are a bit all over the place, so to speak. So that is also a useful signal. I think if we look at, let's say cardiac signals measured at rest, I think those are the ones that typically I would look at and then contextualize them in relation to the person's, subjective feel and behavior, sleep, and those sort of things to try to understand when we might want to implement a change for their training, or if everything is just going well according to our plans.
Right, gotcha. You mentioned subjective, sort of the RPE, if you will. And this isn't something that I had on sort of our list of questions, but do you find that just overall, this isn't really even an HRV question, but with all of this data out there, with all this wearables, which is amazing stuff, I mean, it's great, that people are almost too reliant on data versus, okay, how do I feel today? Do I feel like crap? But my training program from my coach says I should do this. All my wearables say I'm in good, everything's good to go. So I'm just going to go do it, even though I feel horrible. Do you find overall just that people are almost too reliant on the data now and maybe not listening to their bodies as much as they should, that we used to do a lot before because we just didn't simply have all this data at our fingertips?
Yeah, well, I started by saying that, I've developed these technologies, and as a coach, I prescribe training only based on perceived effort.
Okay.
So
Okay. I
that
love
tells
it.
us something about it already.
Yeah.
So, but more seriously, I think technology can be helpful in terms of awareness. So there are many situations in which we can, if we use it properly, be more aware of certain things. It could be exercise intensity using heart rate, or it could be stress using a morning measurement of resting physiology like HRV. But we really need to keep engaging with the process of, subjectively, how do we feel? What's our perception of the effort as we train? All sorts of things, and use the technology maybe sometimes again for awareness to realize something that maybe we're missing. Because again, also perceived effort, I think it's fantastic when we develop it, but it's
Yeah.
not that we have it. It's not an innate ability, right?
Right.
So,
That's a good
you
point.
know, yeah, like me, I just like everyone else as a runner at the beginning, I just, ran basically always moderate or hard because I thought that was easy. Right?
Sure.
Took me a while to learn, what it means to run at different intensities. And, now I can go out without a watch and have a great race, but, it wasn't the case. So I think
Yeah.
it takes a while to get there. And I think that is really what I'm trying to do also with the coaching is, a process of learning to use these tools, and technology can help us. But I also see a lot people that over rely on it for sure, and especially when we use, you know, devices that do also all the work for us. Like, again, wearables, great because they allow a lot of people that maybe don't have otherwise, the ability to start doing these measurements, in their routine, because I don't know, maybe you have young children, all sort of reasons why, the morning is hectic and so
Yeah.
on. But then you wake up and the first thing you do is to see a score before you even think about how you feel. And that will impact you psychologically. And, sometimes it decides how you feel as
Yeah.
opposed to helping you making some adjustments. So I think there are definitely pros and cons. And sometimes it's also, you need to also accept that not everything is for everyone, right? So if
Yeah.
you know that you feel like, these things are impacting you negatively, do not use them, and you're likely to be better off as an athlete or, as a human
Yeah.
than when having this technology, right? It can be helpful for some and less helpful for others. And I think still the goal of technology should be to improve awareness and get us better at not relying on it. But it definitely goes sideways sometimes.
Yeah, those are great points. So, where do you see HRV going as far as the research regarding it and sort of the how it is on so many wearables now? Do you still find that there's more research needed in this space of HRV? And then maybe corollary to that, how do you see that future information potentially being applied for the application on the endurance athlete side or just the human side, the person side?
Yeah, so in the context of training, I think something that interests me is how can we use the data not only to decide when to hold back what we discussed earlier, which I think is a well-established use case at this point, but maybe also for deciding, when it is a good time that we could do the opposite. Maybe it's a good time to load the body particularly because we know it will respond better. There is some preliminary research on this also showing that periods in which HIV is particularly high could be a good time actually to do that. And then it depends also on the endurance sports because, for example, air runners typically we have also other limitations, right? So we cannot just do more without breaking, typically. So there's,
Right.
trade-offs in the context of what can be done. But still, if we periodize things a bit in the longer term, maybe, add a bit more density around the intensity of your sessions or things like that. Also, a lot of the studies, everything is always looked a bit in the short term. So I would be more interested in seeing how this plays out in the longer term with half a year of periodization and this kind of thing. It's always difficult to do these studies really in the long term, but I think we have something to learn there. Um, and similarly for health in general, also I think it would be much more interesting to see how individual data changes over time, over periods of years and decades, which is something that now we are collecting. So we certainly learn more about as opposed to the research we have so far, where we look at a lot of different people, cross-sectionally at a time point that have maybe different ages and different health conditions and so on. And then we say, hey, HIV is related to this or to that, but, we cannot determine if it is in a causal way or if it is just an association that eventually doesn't really mean that much. So I think following longitudinally people, how things change over time, over again, years and decades in relation to their health and performance will help us to understand if HRV is just useful for this feedback loop and to manage stress, or if it is also indicative itself of health and performance.
Gotcha. Gotcha. No, that makes a lot of sense. It I think I'm always so intrigued by technology because I think there's especially maybe now with the AI, becoming a thing, kind of what the potential is there. I'm always just kind of fascinated by all that. Um, so last question, or maybe not a question, last thing to ask you. So maybe you could tell us and our listeners a little bit more about your app, HRV4 training. I don't know, what is it? What does it do? Yeah, just kind of give us the lowdown on that.
Yeah, yeah. So I developed the app about, at this point, almost 15 years ago, I would say. It was at that point the first tool that could track heart rate variability using the phone camera. So that was the main innovation that I had developed, so that
Mm.
you did not need an external sensor. So it still does that, so that you can measure first thing in the morning just with your phone. It does pair also with, chest straps if you prefer to use that, or we can read data from some of the night wearables, the Oura Ring, the Chorus watches. So these kind of devices that are out there. And then I would say the most important things are associated to how the data is interpreted, which is following what the science has shown us. So we never provide, advice based on absolute values, but we track how your data changes over time, relative changes outside of what is considered your normal, which is established over weeks, and then flagged as periods in which intensity could be reduced, as we discussed earlier. And this is always combined with your subjective data as well. I think there's been 2 papers published also in the past year or two that have shown that combining the subjective data, muscle soreness, sleep quality, and things like that, motivation to train with HRV provides even better results in terms of performance outcomes with respect to just using one of the two alone. So that is something also that is in the app. So you do your measurement in the morning, which we think is the ideal moment. And then you fill in your questionnaire where you report, how you feel and things like that. And then the data is combined with respect to your normal range, variations in that, how your subjectives are changing to provide you with advice. So I would say that is the core. Then, there is more, but that is, yeah, what we do. We had many options over the years, but I think eventually what I wanted to do is one thing done well more than trying to do a
Yeah.
billion things,
Yeah.
sometimes in ways that is maybe a bit more questionable. So I think we stay true to that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. Well, no, that's amazing. And I would say that philosophy, I think, probably holds true for most things, right? Kind of get your niche and dial it in. Well, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Marco, for your time on this. For our listeners that want to check out the app as well as Marco's website, you can go to hrv4training.com, and the four is the number, not the word. And you can also go to marcoaltini.com to learn more about Marco and what he can offer. If any of our listeners are interested in a USCA certification, you can use the code ATE75 for $75 off. Well, Marco, thank you so much for your time on this. I certainly learned a heck of a lot more about HRV and really great information out there as far as how to best use it. So thank you so much for your time, and I'm sure our listeners will really love this information.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Thank you, Marco.